To change the world, you first have to be brave enough to break the existing rules. Join our journey through the stories of rebels and outcasts who dared to dream of something better. Click subscribe now and join the ranks of those who dare.
My daughter-in-law was rinsing a glass that was already clean when I realized she couldn't look at me anymore. It was a Tuesday in March, the kind of gray Ohio morning where the light comes through the window flat and colorless, and I was sitting at my own kitchen table, eating the same brand cereal I'd eaten for 30 years. When my son cleared his throat the way he used to when he was 11 and had broken something and was working up the nerve to tell me, he set his coffee mug down too carefully. He looked at his wife instead of me. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk about the house." I want to tell you I felt my stomach drop, that some old instinct flared up and warned me. But the truth is, I just kept eating my cereal. 41 years in that house. I'd raised him in it, buried his father from it, and I had gotten very good in my old age at recognizing the particular silence that comes right before someone you love tries to take something from you. "What about the house?" I said. Not a question. I already knew it wasn't going to be good. His wife, I'll just call her my daughter-in-law, because after that morning I stopped wanting to use her name even in my own head, set the glass down and dried her hands on the dish towel like she needed something to do with them. "We've been talking," she said, "about what makes sense long-term. For everyone. Long-term," I repeated. "You're 71, Mom," my son said, and there it was, laid right out on the table between the cereal bowl and the salt shaker, like he'd been carrying it around in his pocket for weeks waiting for the right morning to set it down. "This house is too much. The stairs, the yard, all of it." And honestly, he glanced at his wife again, like he needed her permission to keep talking. "Honestly, with the new baby coming, we could really use the equity. We've been looking at it as an investment. You move somewhere smaller, somewhere easier, and everybody wins. Everybody wins." I have thought about that phrase more times than I can count since that morning. Everybody wins except the 71-year-old woman whose name was on the deed. I want you to understand something about me before I go any further, because I think it matters for what comes next. My name is not going to mean anything to you, and that's fine. You don't need it. What you need to know is that I was a labor and delivery nurse for 36 years. I caught babies for a living. I have held women's hands through the worst pain of their lives at 3 in the morning and told them truthfully that they were stronger than they thought. I am not a woman who panics. I am a woman who plans. So when my son sat across from me in the kitchen, I had repainted myself 3 different times over 4 decades and told me, essentially, that it was time for me to disappear quietly into some assisted living facility so he and his wife could cash out my home. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I set down my spoon very carefully, the way you set down something you don't want to break, and I said, "I'll think about it." That was all. I'll think about it. What I didn't say was that I had already started thinking in that exact moment with a clarity that surprised even me. Because while my son talked about equity and long-term planning and what made sense for everyone, I was doing math in my head. I was thinking about the deed, which had my name on it and only my name, because my husband had insisted on that years before he died, in a moment of foresight neither of us fully understood the gift of at the time. I was thinking about my lawyer, a sharp little woman named Adriana Folsom, who had handled my husband's estate, and who I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, but whose number I still had memorized. I was thinking about how long it would take to sell a 4-bedroom colonial in a market like this one. I finished my cereal. I rinsed my bowl. I told my son and his wife I needed to get to my water aerobics class, which was true, and I left them sitting at my table looking, I imagine, fairly pleased with themselves. I want to back up, though, because you should understand how we got to that kitchen table. And it didn't happen in one morning. It happened over about 18 months, in small increments, the way water gets into a foundation. You don't notice it until the crack is already there. It started after my husband died. 43 years married, and then he was gone in 11 days. A stroke that took everything fast and left me standing in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, trying to remember how to be a person by myself. My son came around a lot in those first months. I'll give him that. He helped me with the paperwork, the insurance, the 1,000 small administrative cruelties that come with losing someone. I was grateful. I was, for a while, genuinely moved by how present he was. But somewhere in there, the visits started to have an angle to them. He'd bring his wife, and she'd walk through my house with this particular look on her face. Not unkind, exactly, but assessing, appraising. She'd run her hand along the banister and say things like, "This is solid oak, you know. They don't make staircases like this anymore," in a tone that I told myself at the time was admiration, and that I understand now was inventory. They started asking about my plans, gently at first. "Have you thought about downsizing, Mom? It might be nice not to have to keep up this whole place." Then less gently. "My son brought over brochures for a senior living community 40 minutes away. The kind with a dining hall and a craft room and a van that takes you to the pharmacy on Tuesdays. He left them on my counter like he was just leaving them there, not making a point, except he made the same point 3 more times over the following months. And then, 6 weeks before that morning at the kitchen table, I found out, not from my son, but from my neighbor, who heard it from her daughter, who works at the title company downtown, that someone matching my son's description had come in asking questions about how a property transfer works when the owner is, quote, older and maybe not up for handling all the paperwork herself. I sat with that for 3 days before I said anything to anyone. I want to be honest with you about what that felt like, because I don't think people talk about it enough. It wasn't just anger, though there was plenty of that. It was a specific, quiet grief, the grief of realizing that the person you raised, the person whose fevers you sat up with, whose first heartbreak you held him through, has started looking at you and seeing an obstacle, a liability, a line item standing between him and something he wants. I didn't confront him. I want to be very clear about that, because I think the instinct, when you find out someone is scheming against you, is to march in and demand answers, to make a scene, to force the truth out into the open, where you can fight about it properly. I have learned, in 71 years, that confrontation tips your hand. It tells the other person exactly what you know, exactly what you're afraid of, and gives them time to adjust their plan. I did not want to give my son time to adjust his plan. So instead, the morning after that conversation in the kitchen, I called Adriana Folsom. "It's been a while," she said when she picked up, and I could hear the smile in her voice, the particular warmth of someone who liked you and was glad to hear from you even though you'd let too much time pass. "I need your help with something," I told her, "and I need it kept quiet." I told her everything. The brochures, the title company, the conversation at the kitchen table, my son's careful, rehearsed phrase about equity and what made sense for everyone. Adriana was quiet for a moment when I finished. "Do you want to sell the house?" she asked. "Or do you want to make sure he can't make you?" It was a good question, and I thought about it honestly before I answered. "Both," I said finally. "I'm done with that house, Adriana. It's too for me, he's not wrong about that part, but I will not be pushed out of my own home by my own son so he can profit off it. If I sell it, it's going to be on my terms, in my own time, for my own reasons. And he is going to find out about it the same way I found out he'd been asking questions at the title company, after the fact." She laughed, a short, sharp laugh, the kind of laugh I imagined she didn't let many clients hear. "I like this version of you," she said. What followed was 11 weeks of the strangest double life I have ever lived. By day, I was Mom, agreeable, a little tired, nodding along when my son brought up the conversation again, letting him believe he was wearing me down, that his patient, steady pressure was working. I let him think he was winning. I asked vague, non-committal questions about the senior community brochures, just enough to keep him hopeful, to keep him from suspecting anything. I even let my daughter-in-law take measurements in my living room one Sunday afternoon, for what she called just getting a feel for the space. And I stood in my own kitchen and watched her measure the windows for furniture that would never be hers. And I smiled and offered her iced tea. By night, I was working with Adriana and a realtor she trusted named Holt Bridgewater, a quiet, efficient man who understood discretion the way some people understand music, instinctively, like it was a language he'd been born speaking. We listed the house privately, off the public market, marketed only to a small pool of pre-qualified buyers. We scheduled showings for the hours my son and his wife were both reliably at work. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, 10 to noon, when she had her pottery class and he had standing meetings he never missed. I'd leave the house to run errands, and Holt would bring buyers through, and I'd come back 2 hours later to find everything exactly as I'd left it. No trace, no evidence. Nothing but the quiet satisfaction of knowing the wheels were turning. There was an offer within 17 days. A young couple, expecting their first child, who walked through my kitchen and saw in their words. So much love built into this place, which nearly undid me, honestly hearing that, because it was true, there was love built into every inch of it. And I wanted it to go to people who would recognize that, rather than people who saw it as equity. We closed in 5 weeks. 5 weeks, during which my son continued to bring up the brochures, continued to mention, with increasing frequency, a particular facility called Hawthorne Glen that he and his wife had apparently toured just to see, continued to ask, with what he probably thought was subtlety, whether I'd had any more thoughts about the house. And every time I said the same thing, I'm thinking about it. And every time it was true, in the sense that I was thinking about it constantly, just not in any direction he imagined. The day of closing, I sat in Adriana's conference room and signed the last of the paperwork with a pen that felt, absurdly, like it weighed 10 pounds. Holt shook my hand. Adriana hugged me, which she had never done in 15 years of knowing her professionally, and said, 48 hours, and then you tell him. Not before. I used those 48 hours to do the parts of this I hadn't told even Adriana about. I had already rented a small house. Modest single story, no stairs. 20 minutes from my best friend Helen's place, and not incidentally, 40 minutes in the opposite direction from Hawthorne Glen. I'd done it quietly, weeks earlier, under a version of my name with my middle name first. Just enough of a difference that a casual search wouldn't catch it. I had a moving company scheduled. I had already, very deliberately, gone through the house and set aside exactly what I wanted to keep. Robert's reading chair, the quilt my mother made, the photographs, the good china we never used because we were always saving it for an occasion that never quite arrived, and arranged, through a donation service, for everything else to be collected the same week the movers came for my things, so that by the time my son let himself in with his key, expecting to find his childhood home exactly as he'd left it, there would be almost nothing there at all. I chose a Thursday. He had a meeting that ran until 1. I knew because I'd asked, the way you'd ask any harmless question, what his schedule looked like that week. I imagine, because I wasn't there for this part by design, that he came home for lunch, the way he sometimes did, let himself in with the key he'd had since he was 16, and stood in the front hallway of an empty house. I imagine the particular silence of a place that's been lived in for 41 years, and then all at once, isn't anymore. No furniture, no photographs on the stairwell, no smell of the candles I always kept burning in the front room. Just bare walls, clean carpet, and a single envelope on the kitchen counter. In the exact spot where he'd set his phone face down the morning, he told me it was time for a different living arrangement. Inside the envelope was a short letter. I'd rewritten it 4 times to get the tone right. Not cruel, not triumphant, just clear. It explained that I had sold the house, that the sale was complete, the funds were mine, and that I had moved somewhere of my own choosing, on my own terms, in my own time. It explained that I loved him, that I would always love him, and that loving him did not require me to hand over my home so he could call it an investment. It said that I hoped, someday, he would understand the difference between taking care of his mother and taking from her. He called me 40 minutes later. I let it ring through twice before I answered. "Where is everything?" he said, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager and I'd caught him in a lie he thought was airtight. Not anger exactly. Something closer to vertigo. "I sold the house," I said. "You'll have gotten my letter. You can't just," he started, and then stopped, because of course I could, because it had been my name on the deed the entire time, and we both knew it. "I can," I said gently, because I didn't need to be cruel to be firm. I did. There was a long silence. I could hear his wife in the background, asking something I couldn't make out, and him saying, away from the phone, "She sold it. She actually sold it," in a tone of pure disbelief, as though it had never once occurred to either of them that the woman whose name was on the title might also have a will of her own. "Mom," he said, coming back to the phone, and his voice had changed again, gone smaller. "Where are you living?" "Somewhere comfortable," I said. "Somewhere I chose." "I didn't mean for it to." He stopped. Started again. "We were just trying to think ahead. For the family." "I know," I told him. And I meant it, in a way, because I do believe that somewhere underneath the calculations about equity in Hawthorne Glen, there was a version of my son who genuinely thought he was being practical, responsible, forward-thinking, the way he'd see it described in some article about generational wealth and aging parents. I don't think he ever fully let himself feel the other part, the part where what he was actually doing was deciding, on my behalf and without my consent, what my life was going to look like for the rest of it. "I know you thought you were thinking ahead, but you forgot to ask me what I wanted. You forgot I was still allowed to want things." He didn't have an answer for that. I didn't expect him to. It's been almost a year now. I won't pretend the silence afterward was easy. It wasn't. There were 2 months where we didn't speak at all, where every family gathering had a hole in it, shaped exactly like my son, and where I lay awake some nights wondering if I had done something unforgivable, if I had been too proud, too sharp, if there had been some gentler way through it that I'd been too hurt to find. But here is what I have come to believe. In the years since, sitting most mornings now in Robert's old reading chair, in a smaller house that is entirely, unambiguously mine, there is a particular kind of disappearing that gets asked of women my age. Very politely, very reasonably, always under the banner of what's practical, what makes sense, what's best for everyone. And it always seems to require that we get smaller, quieter, more agreeable, more grateful for whatever arrangement someone else has decided suits us. I had spent 36 years catching other people's babies, holding other women's hands through their hardest hours, and somewhere in there I had also, apparently, absorbed the lesson that my own wants came last. That morning at the kitchen table, my son didn't invent that lesson. He just tried to collect on it. I am glad I didn't let him. We talk now, my son and I, carefully, the way you talk to someone after a fracture has set, but before you fully trust the bone again. He came to see the new house in the spring, stood in my doorway a little stiffly, and said it was nice. Smaller than the old place, he said. Easier to take care of, I told him, and watched something complicated cross his face when he understood I was using his own old language back at him on purpose. His daughter was born in June. I held her in the hospital, in a chair by the window, and I thought about all the babies I had caught over the years, all the mothers I had told they were stronger than they knew, and I thought, looking down at this small, furious, red-faced new person, that I hoped someday, if anyone ever tried to quietly decide her life for her, under the cover of being practical, she would remember that her grandmother had a name on a deed and a mind of her own, and she had used both.